So welcome everyone. So the title of this presentation tonight is More People, How South Bend Lost 50,000 People in 50 Years. And we have tonight Joe Molnar with us. He is the author of a series of articles on this topic that I highly recommend. And I'm very excited to have you here tonight, Joe. I'm very excited to hear your presentation. So whenever you're ready, feel free to take it away. Like I said, audience, feel free to put your questions in the chat. Other than that, please, we ask that you stay muted during the presentation to make sure everyone can hear Joe.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks everyone for coming virtually. It's a little strange to do this virtually, but it's the world we live in for maybe not too much longer. But as Sarah said, my name is Joe Molnar, and I wrote this series titled More People, How South Bend Lost 50,000 People in 50 Years. It was kind of a pet project of mine last fall, and it came from a couple questions, but I did want to thank West SB, which was the site that ran the series. Jacob Titus, who's the main creator of the site, was a wonderful host, and he was an editor, as well as Michael DeVita, who is one of my coworkers, and then Ali Brand and my wife Danielle Molnar also helped edit the series, so they helped fix all my errors. But where did the series come from? Why does it exist? Well, it's because I had this question: where did everyone go? I'm a lifelong South Bend resident, except for college, and you can't spend a lot of time in South Bend without seeing things like this, what I call ghost architecture or ghost remains of a time before. This is clearly a sidewalk connection. The sidewalk's down here up to a house that no longer exists. So I would see these things throughout my life in South Bend, and I always wondered, well, where did everyone go? Clearly someone lived here once before, and now they no longer do. Why? Why did that happen? These empty lots, for one, have negative side effects for the city that we'll get into. Obviously, the road in front of it still has to be paved. The police still have to protect this area. The firefighters still have to patrol this area, but there's no taxes coming from it. But then even from a more even from a different perspective, a more social perspective, there's less community, there's less people around. This person no longer has a neighbor. So why did that happen? Where did everyone go? Why did South Bend lose so many people? And I started writing the series because I was unhappy with the answer I would get. I would ask people this, or I'd talk to people about this question, and they always gave me this frame of mind. They would always say, well, there was Studebaker. I'm sure most of you who are very well familiar with South Bend know this is Studebaker at its height. These are the only two buildings remaining from this massive complex. And if you know Studebaker Building 84, you know this building is massive. And Studebaker at its height employed over 20,000 people. It, along with Oliver, Bendix, a number of other Singer, another number of other manufacturers employed thousands of people in the area, and that was what the story was always told, that manufacturing grew in the city, and that helped build this. This is downtown South Bend in the 1920s. It's a great urban place. For some frame of reference, here is the courthouse today. Here is where the county city building would sit. So the wealth from Studebaker and all those other manufacturers helped the city grow and build this great place. And then the story always goes, well, Studebaker closed. We all know that Studebaker closed in 1963, shuttering its plants. At the time, about 7,000 people were employed and out of work overnight. But then we also know there were a number of other manufacturers over the 60s and 70s and into the 80s that closed. Oliver, Bendix shrank significantly. A number of manufacturers left the community. And then the city did itself no favors by practices in urban renewal. So we wiped out half of our downtown in the hope to bring back business, but we all know that retail and other businesses fled the downtown core for the outskirts, Grape Road area, the mall, and on the far south side. And that's the story. We lost manufacturing, the city didn't do much to help itself, and we saw this population decline. This is the population history from our city's first birth as its incarnation of what we know as South Bend in the 1840s, all the way to 2010, our last official census that we have the numbers for. And as you can see, starting in 1960, that number started to fall. over time. And because Studebaker closed in 1963, it's very easy to link those two events in people's minds. Oh, the 60s are when everything started to go downhill. They must be linked. It must be Studebaker's fault. But if you think about it slightly differently, you can get a much different story. This is the St. Joseph County population history from that same 1830, 1840 to today, or at least 2010. And as you can see, as the growth did dramatically start to slow in the 60s, it did not stop. We've gained about 30,000 people as a whole county. And anyone who knows South Bend, anyone who's from here knows St. Joseph County is a regional labor market. People live in South Bend, work in Mishawaka. People live in Granger, work in South Bend. It is not so much that if you lose jobs in one area, it will only affect that area. So I thought, well, if losing the manufacturing jobs didn't cause St. Joseph County as a whole to lose population, well, what did? Mishawaka lost half of its manufacturing jobs. It hasn't lost population. So what gives? And if you actually pull out South Bend from the rest of St. Joseph County, you see a even more stark picture. So this is, again, the blue line is that very graph I just showed you, South Bend's population. The orange graph, though, is the rest of St. Joseph County, basically the suburbs and Mishawaka. And if you look here in 1920, it basically starts to shoot up, and it has not stopped ever since. It's still going up today. We think by 2020, it will still keep going up, and it's almost gone up in an exact linear pattern. 1960 isn't even a blip on this graph. Why did the closing of Studebaker, why did the closing of Oliver and the shuttering of thousands of manufacturing jobs lead to South Bend's decline, but not the county as a whole? And when I really thought about that, I thought there must be something more here, because if it was simply the fact that the county losing good manufacturing jobs caused South Bend's decline, it would have done the same thing to the county as a whole, but it didn't. Why did South Bend fall while Mishawaka and St. Joseph County continued to rise? And that was the crux of what I wanted to get into. If it wasn't just the factories, those were a clear part of it, but what else changed? St. Joseph County today, at this moment, has more people residing in its boundaries than at any other time in history. There are more people today in St. Joseph County than at the height of Studebaker. The county managed to keep increasing its population in the same economy, job market, and weather conditions as South Bend. Sometimes people just say, oh, well, people fled for the weather. Well, the weather is not much different in Mishawaka than South Bend. So there must be forces larger than the loss of losing factory jobs that caused South Bend's fall in population. And that gets us into what I call a series of unfortunate events. All these things taken together will tell the picture that we're going to get into today. You can't just look at the decline of manufacturing. While that was vitally important and that dramatically changed the area, you have to look at suburbanization, declining of household sizes, annexation conflicts between the city and the suburbs, intentional, unintentional racist housing policies that led to different housing outcomes, and then the late 2000s housing bubble. We're going to talk about all these. Hopefully it won't be too boring for you, and then we will start to see that it wasn't just Studebaker closing. But we have to first tackle why 50,000 people in 50 years. That's kind of the catchy title of the series. When if you look at the graph I showed in 1960, our population was 132,000. Today in 2020, we think it's about 102,000. So that drops only about 30. Where do I get the 50,000 number? Well, if you look at this graphic here, these are from Sanborn historical maps. So these are historical maps of the buildings of South Bend. Everything colored in here, all these are actually all little buildings. This was the geographic footprint of South Bend in 1960. It might be missing some up by the Edison Park area and the Erskine Park area, but this is basically all the buildings that were in South Bend in 1960. And in all those buildings, we had 132,000 people. Now today, this blue line is the new city limits of South Bend as of 2020. And in that entire blue area, we have 102,000. But if you just look at this area that was historic South Bend, that was South Bend in 1960, that number's dropped actually to 86,000. Nearly 50,000 people have fled this core of the city. Some have fled just to the other parts of the city that were annexed, but many fled elsewhere. That's where the title comes from. And this was widespread across historic South Bend. This is not just a West Side problem. Sometimes when we talk about population decline, people always think it's just a few neighborhoods on the West Side. but it was all of historic South Bend. These are census tracts from their increase or decrease in population from 1970 to 2010. As you can see, the entire core of the city has been hollowed out. This is downtown right here to try to get you some reference points. Here is Notre Dame. The Ireland Road and Erskine Target is right in here. And the airport is right over here. So that kind of gets you some context. All the blue is where we've gained population. Well, that was because there was no houses there in 1970. The city did manage to annex some property on the south side and some on the northwest, and that's where we've picked up a little bit of population. But all the core neighborhoods have lost people, even neighborhoods that you wouldn't necessarily think. River Park, for example, you can go down River Park today. There's no vacant house, or there aren't vacant lots, but River Park's lost 24% of its population down here and 21% over here. Yes, the west side was hurt the hardest, but it was widespread across the city. And how did that happen? Well, you have to talk about declining household size. And to illustrate the power of that, I will just give you a couple graphics here. So this is an aerial view of River Park. Like I mentioned, this is a pretty, about 10 blocks of River Park, just north of Mishawaka Avenue. As you can see, there might be a couple places where there once was a house, now there no longer is, but the urban fabric is very much intact. Almost every single house that existed 50 years ago exists today. Now, if we turn over to St. Hedwig's neighborhood, this is about 5 or 6 blocks near St. Hedwig's on the near west side of town. There are lots of vacant lots. Anywhere I put a big star, there's at least one vacant lot or more. This is where there used to be a house in the neighborhood, but that house has been torn down. And if you just look at the two neighborhoods side by side, and I asked you which neighborhood lost more people, you would automatically assume it's the neighborhood without houses, but you'd be wrong. This section of River Park has lost about 21.4% of its peak population. The Dalbert St. Hedwig's neighborhood here has lost 19.4%. So it's actually suffered less population decline than River Park. Well, how has that happened? Well, it's because this neighborhood has become a central starting point of the Hispanic immigration story in South Bend. This neighborhood is largely Hispanic today, and recent immigrants to the United States historically have always had larger household sizes, while River Park has traditionally been a white and Black neighborhood that has followed the city's trajectory. And that neighborhood has entirely lost people because there's less people in each house. As a city as a whole, in 1960, there were about 3.2 people in every household. Today, that's fallen to about 2.54. So in very simple terms, if you used to have a street and it had 10 houses on it, there used to be about 32 people in each house on that block. Now there's only about 25. And that's almost entirely because people today have less children. I'm sure you're all aware, your parents' generation probably had more siblings, their parents' generation even more siblings. And that's the American story. Every generation has gotten slowly smaller. And if you have the same amount of houses, that's automatically going to lead to less people in your city. If instead that didn't happen, if instead that all the people kept having the same amount of children, the household decline didn't happen, if instead of losing 25,000 people, if the size of each household remained constant, the city would actually have gained 6,000 people from 1960 to 1990. The initial population decline from when we always think, oh, Studebaker closed in the 60s, all that population drop that was happening then was entirely because families were simply getting smaller. And here is a nice graph with lots of numbers, and I'll try to break it down for you. But this gets into the two different types of decline we'll talk about. Here is the South Bend population figure. Here's the year. And here are the number of households. So this is households very traditionally, if you're in a house, say a couple with a child, that's a household of 3 people. And here on the right column, this shows how many households the city gained. If you can look here, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, all the way to 2000, the city was still gaining households. We were never losing households when Studebaker closed. But why were we starting to lose people? Well, you have to talk then about suburbanization. As you can see here, the population per household was dropping dramatically fast in the 70s and 80s and 90s. People were having a lot of less children, and that the baby boomers had a lot of less children than their parents. But the households kept going up. South Bend kept slowly gaining households, but it wasn't enough to make up for the fact that this number was declining so quickly. So our population fell dramatically as well. But if you look closely, you'll see a difference. This has been happening since South Bend was founded. If you go back to the 1850s, 1860s, we actually had a population per household of about 6. And that fell decade over decade over decade to 1940 when it got to 3.6, and it kept falling. This was not something new to South Bend, but it was the first time that South Bend couldn't keep up with it. And if you see this dramatic change here, in the 1950s, South Bend gained 6,500 households. In the 1970s, South Bend only gained 354. Still a decent number, but not even close to the number it was growing before. Well, what changed? In a simple word, the suburbs changed. This is a pretty common graphic. This is from the 1950s. There was a dramatic push post-World War II in South Bend from the federal government, from state governments and local governments to incentivize suburban living. Things like the GI Bill and many other programs the Federal Housing Authority put in place to help push suburban construction. But in the 1950s, at least in our area, the suburbs were inside the city limits. This is Edison Park today. This is a quintessential suburb from the early 1950s. As you can see, it's still very much a city neighborhood. It has sidewalks. It has pretty much basically a grid pattern. It's centered around Edison Park School, a big public asset. But this was the suburbs of 1950s. This was the very edge of town. This was the newest neighborhood going in. All these streets have names linked to World War II, like Congress and Eisenhower. This was very much aimed at returning World War II veterans, and this was the suburbs at the time, small 800 and 900 square foot houses on city lots. But this was the suburbs. This was the outer edge of town. When you get into the 1960s and 1970s, however, you get into more of this. This is an aerial view of Clay Township today, pretty far north of Notre Dame. These houses were all built in the late 60s and early 1970s. As you can see, the sidewalks are gone, much more suburban, typical suburban feel that you'd think. Cul-de-sacs start popping up, very long blocks that don't really connect like you think they should. And then by the 1980s, we see the rise of Granger. This is a very typical neighborhood design in Granger, very long cul-de-sacs. If you live here and want to talk to your neighborhood here, you have to walk about 5 miles to get to them. This is the suburbs that we know today. But why weren't those new suburbs built in the South Bend city limits? We did some of that on the south side, but what changed? Why in the 1950s and 1940s suburban development was in South Bend? Post 1960, all that county growth, all that growth we saw in that county graph, why did that not happen in the South Bend city limits? Well, it's because the suburbs, these newly developing suburbs, fought a war to stay out. From starting in the late 1950s all the way through the 1990s, the city was constantly battling developers who were building new developments out in the county who did not at all want to be part of the city of South Bend. The city did try repeatedly to annex the suburbs. This is a map from the early 1990s. The city put out an annexation report. It wanted to annex all of Clay Township, much of German Township, the south side. The city tried repeatedly and failed. Well, why did it fail? Well, it's because the new residents who were moving out to these new developments didn't want the city and they fought back. This was one of thousands of examples I could have picked out of the South Bend Tribune. This is dated December 6, 1992, during the last big push by the city to annex the suburbs. And Ms. Dolores Kuspert says, as residents of Clay Township have said before, we don't want the city, we don't need the city. Clay Township residents will fight and win the battle. We will not be annexed by South Bend. It was a very harsh divide between the city and its suburbs. And as we'll get into a little later, the suburbs and the city did depend on each other. They were one area, but the suburbs didn't want to be in the city limits. Part of that came into taxes. At the time, this is prior to the property tax caps that went in place about a decade ago, your taxes were higher in the city than in the county, and people were afraid if they got annexed, their taxes would go up. There were obviously a lot of other reasons as well. And it got so bad that a whole organization called Hoosier Suburbia was founded right here in St. Joseph County. And this became a statewide group that had chapters all over the state of Indiana that pressured and led went down to the state house to influence state legislators to make it very, very difficult for cities to annex any more land. This became a statewide organization that started right here in St. Joseph County battling South Bend. And the end result of this is that the city lost. The city lost this war, and in the early 1990s, we gave it one last bid, and we once again failed. It got bogged down in court cases. What would happen is the city would attempt to annex an area, those residents would sue, and the city, not being flush with cash, would have to end up pulling out of the court case and letting it stall out. So annexation has stalled. South Bend tried to annex Notre Dame in the early 1970s to capture the student population of that group and the money that would come from federal tax dollars of having the university. That failed. Notre Dame fought that stringently, and that was failed in the early 1970s. Like I said, multiple court cases were fought by the suburbs to halt further annexation. And city abandoned, basically as a policy, large-scale annexation attempts post-1990s, and that is continued to today. It got so bad that state law was changed only for St. Joseph County. So state reps from suburban areas in the South Bend area passed a law. They got their colleagues in the state legislature to pass a law that only affected St. Joseph County and made it more difficult for South Bend and Mishawaka to annex areas than no other cities were affected by this law. That lasted for about 15 years before the state law changed for the effect the whole state. That's how bad this conflict got between the city and its suburbs, that we were changing state law to only affect South Bend. And what is the end result of that? Well, South Bend lost. This is an aerial view of Granger in 1987. Here is State Road 23. Here is that aerial today. As you can see, this is a lake here, this U-shaped lake, that's that lake right here. Massive, massive housing growth in Granger in the in this time period we're talking about. After Clay Township had filled out, it started spilling into Granger. And this was development that was clearly part of the South Bend region, and we'll get into that this Granger clearly is part of South Bend, the broader South Bend, but was intentionally developed outside of the city limits. And South Bend lost because of that. Nearly half of all employed residents in Granger who work today work in the city limits of South Bend. So what was the result of that? Well, that suburbanization left South Bend very vulnerable because as I showed in the graph before, we were still growing, but it was very slow. And that growth was not making up for the fact that there were less people in each household. And that left the city where it had not captured the growth of its region. So we were a declining city in a growing region. And that left us very vulnerable for what I've called the worst decade in South Bend's history. This is the decade from 2000 to 2010. Because this is the first time, and hopefully we'll find out soon, but hopefully the only time in the city's history where we actually lost households. We had been losing people since the 1960s, but that was just because the families were getting smaller. The actual households were actually ticking up slowly. But in one decade, in the 2000s, we lost over 3,000 households, wiping out all the growth from 1960 to 2010. And if you look at here, at the population per household, by 1990, this number has bottomed out. Essentially today, people are having the same amount of children, or at least living in the same 2.5 people per household that we were back in the 1990s. And we even saw a slight growth in 2000. If you were telling this story in 2001, you would think maybe the worst was behind South Bend and that we were growing again. But look at this dramatic decline, going from gaining 650 households in the 90s to losing 3,148 households in the 2000s. And that led to a dramatic drop in population. And on a physical level, what does that look like? What does it look like when you lose over 3,000 households? Well, this is a neighborhood in 1998 on the near northwest side. And this is 30 years after Studebaker closed. This is 20 years after Drury's closed. You can't tell me that this neighborhood hasn't gotten over the fact that Studebaker closed. This is 30 years later in 1998. 20 years later, it's become this. This is that same neighborhood today. And I'll do that one more time so you can look. Try to pick out a block, maybe pick out this one or this one. Look how many households are on that block, and then look today. That only happens when you have wide scale population decline that you had not seen before. As you can see, while the neighborhood had some holes by the late 1990s, the neighborhood was still largely intact. That has mostly gone in some of these neighborhoods. What caused this? Well, you have to talk about the 2000s housing bubble. And this is a very complicated topic. I'm sure many of you lived through it, and it's not good memories of this time, but in very quick, and there's so much more to say about this that I won't be able to say, and there's great books on it as well. In the late 90s and early 2000s, housing prices began to rise irresponsibly fast. And this was primarily based on the fact that banks began to relax standards on mortgages. There were very low interest rates at the time. Banks began to try to push things like adjustable rate mortgages, which if you're not sure what those are, basically when you sign up for your mortgage, your interest rate was maybe 4%. In year 2, it's 5%. In year 3, it's 6%. And it just keeps going up until maybe it hits 10 or 12%. This convinced low-income buyers, sorry about that, this convinced low-income buyers that they could afford a mortgage payment that year 3, year 4 down the line, they could no longer afford. This led to gross speculation in the housing market and also led to a rise in South Bend's case of bad landlords, LLCs, what we saw in the city. So these were essentially paper companies that were set up to buy property. And because property was rising fast, they would buy the property and they wouldn't do anything with it. They would just rent it. They wouldn't do anything to maintain the property, hoping that maybe 5, 6 years down the line, they could sell it for more because housing always goes up. That was the mantra. Well, we all know what happened. For a variety of reasons, the bubble burst. Housing prices cratered across the country. People ended up owing more on their houses than what they were worth, and foreclosures skyrocketed. In South Bend alone, 15% of all households experienced foreclosure. That is an insanely large number in one decade for 15% of all your households to have a foreclosure, for the bank to take your house. But why was South Bend hit so hard when this was a national phenomenon? This happened across the country. All houses lost value during the late 2000s. Well, it was because, like I said earlier, South Bend was very vulnerable to this. At the time, the average housing price in South Bend was about $40,000 to $50,000, or at least in a lot of our historic inner neighborhoods. Now, if you take all houses, remember, averaged across the country, lost about 50%. Some areas were spared and didn't lose quite as much. Some lost even more, but that was the average. If you take half the value from a $40,000 house, it's only worth 20 grand. If you do that same thing to a house out on the suburbs that was already worth 300 grand, and if you take $150,000 of its value from it, that is absolutely terrible for that house owner. But that house still has a lot of value. It still makes sense for that homeowner to live there. It still makes sense for that homeowner to put a roof on. A roof costs about $8,000 to $10,000. Why would you put an $8,000, $10,000 roof on a $20,000 house? You're never going to get that money back. You will hopefully get that money back on a $150,000 house. Furthermore, if your house is worth this little, if we're talking $10,000, $5,000, $15,000 houses, banks will not issue you a loan to buy that house because the bank knows it might not get its money back in the end. The asset is not worth enough for the loan. It's not even worth their time to spend to do all the paperwork on a $5,000 to $15,000 house. That's not the case with a $150,000 house. Again, this hit pretty much equally, but because South Bend was starting from such a lower standpoint, it was much more devastating. The suburban house, you can sit on it for 10 to 15 years and it slowly will rise. And as we've seen today, housing prices have rebounded and are again going up dramatically. And what does that look like again illustrated? Well, these are all foreclosures between 2001 to 2017. Again, this is downtown here to help get you some perspective. Here is Portage Avenue, here's Lincoln Way, and here is Western. Widespread foreclosures across the inner part of South Bend. The west side was clearly hit the hardest, but the southeast near Riley High School down here was hit hard. River Park, which I just showed you, even though none of the houses ended up being torn down, River Park was dramatically hurt as well. Lots of bad things happened from this housing crash. The number of vacant houses doubled in 1 year. This is a pretty simple graph from 1960 to 2010. This is the number of vacant housing units in the city of South Bend, and this is how much they increased from the previous decade. As you see, from 1960 to 2010, it nearly doubled or came close to doubling or a little more. But that was over 40 years. Not good, but it was a slow problem that could be solved slowly. And by the 2000s, we think if you look at this, we actually went down. The number of vacant housing units in South Bend fell from 1990 to 2000. Just look at the jump from 2000 to 2010. A dramatic increase in vacant housing, over 3,000 in one decade. So how you can look at it, and this really all happened from about 2004 to 2009, but if you just look at the decade, over 300 houses were being abandoned every year in the city of South Bend. And what are the costs of that? Well, here's another 1998 to today. Here's another one. Whole blocks were emptied out. This is on the southeast side, whole blocks emptied out. And here is a large span of the northwest side. Here is Portage, here is Lincoln Way. Here's the city cemetery down here. The trees make this look better a story than it even is. But as you can see, 1998, again, 30 years after Studebaker's demise, all of this neighborhood is still very largely intact. I'm not saying it's a prosperous neighborhood. I'm not saying it's even a wealthy neighborhood, but it still was an intact neighborhood to today, where just mass population decline. And you can only get this if you get the population dropping out dramatically. And that all happened by 2010. All that happened in the span of a decade. So that is the two different types of South Bend's population decline. You can't just think of it all as, oh, starting in 1960, the number started going down, and that's just one story. It really is two stories. It's the story of the fact that South Bend still grew slowly in the post-Studebaker era, but it wasn't enough to make up for the fact that our population per household was shrinking. Now, that's not to say South Bend wasn't getting poor, and there were other dramatic economic costs of Studebaker and other manufacturers leaving, but from a purely population standpoint, that had pretty much ceased to be an issue starting in 2000, and a whole nother problem happened. And don't get me wrong, closing the factories hurt. But South Bend today, this is kind of a myth. Whenever I tell this story, people always say, well, you're still discounting how big of a deal it was for deindustrialization. Well, let's look at jobs in South Bend then and compare to the rest of the area. South Bend is still the jobs leader of St. Joseph County. Here are the number of jobs as of 2018 in both South Bend, St. Joseph County, and the South Bend Metro. South Bend had 66,000 some jobs out of the whole 125,000 in the county. If you look at that as a percentage, South Bend had 53%, has today 53% of all jobs in St. Joseph County, but it only has 38% of the population. So a lot of times people always say, well, in order for South Bend to grow population, just needs more jobs, more jobs, more jobs. And I'm not saying jobs are bad by any means, and we need more jobs in our community and more well-paying jobs, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything for your city if those people don't live there. At the metro level, it's even more dramatic. Of the 135,000 jobs in the metro, South Bend has basically half, but less than a third of the population. How can that happen? Well, it's because 3/4 of all people who work in South Bend don't live here. So if we want to talk about the jobs being important and the fact that our factories closed and that's why we lost population, well, if those factories still existed, chances are most of the people who would work in those factories wouldn't live in the city. You could still imagine a time today, say Studebaker got bought out by Chrysler or GM or Ford, and there was still a plant here making cars. I bet our population figures wouldn't look much different, because you have 3/4 of all people who live in the city or who work in the city don't live here. And you can see that by looking at night and daytime populations. At night, or our daytime or our resident population, that number is about 102,000. But during the day, and this was pre-COVID, so give me a little break on that one, but pre-COVID, on a random Tuesday at 2 p.m., we would have about 123,000. So that means 20,000 people every day come into the city, work here, go to the Morris, all those other things, and then they leave every night. So clearly South Bend has still this drive of economic standpoint where South Bend still has this economic vitality. In the case of jobs, it just hasn't done a good job of getting the people who have those jobs to live here, or the people who live here to have those jobs. And sometimes I'll tell people that, and they say, well, the jobs in South Bend are really poor paying, and the jobs in Mishawaka and in the county, those are the better paying jobs. Well, again, that's not even true. The census, which is where all this data comes from in this presentation, the census divvies up jobs into 3 different economic brackets that I've just called bottom, middle, and top. South Bend jobs are better paying than Mishawaka jobs and are better paying than St. Joe County jobs on a whole. And again, remember, South Bend has more jobs than its population counts would say. So South Bend has better paying jobs and has least worse paying jobs than the county on average. Again, that's not saying we couldn't do more. We could always use more, but that's only one part of the puzzle. Mishawaka has grown, but it's not because their jobs are super good paying. Granger has grown, but Granger has no jobs. It has barely any jobs, and the jobs it does have are largely in the service industry. Granger hasn't seen large-scale population growth because it has a lot of jobs. So it's kind of hard to say, well, if South Bend just grows a lot of jobs, its population will come back. But why should we care? Why does this need to even be noted? A lot of people say, well, we're all just one region. South Bend is just St. Joseph County. It doesn't really matter where the people live. We should just care about the county, care about the region. Well, for one, you should look at it from an equity standpoint, because wealth generated in the city does a lot to generate that wealth. All those job centers, all those areas where people are employed are surrounded by city roads, are policed by city police and fire protection, have city water and city sewer to go in them. But then the people making that money doesn't stay in South Bend. And South Bend, despite having the highest paying jobs, is actually poorer than all the surrounding communities, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? You'd think the place with the best paying jobs would have the highest median income, but it's actually the opposite. And that has a negative consequence on our schools, our streets, our parks, our crime rate, and our poverty rate. They're all negatively affected. And what are some of this costs? What are the costs of South Bend's population decline and of this weird population decline where we're a shrinking city in a growing region? Well, if anyone's paid any attention to the news, you can tell over the past 10 years, we've been closing a lot of schools. That's because we have less people here. When you have less people, you're inevitably going to have less children who are going to go into schools less. There's more to it in South Bend too, with the rise of vouchers and school choice in the state of Indiana. But just from a purely standpoint, if you have a lot less people, you're going to have a lot less kids. Your schools are going to have to shrink. That is a cost of population decline. And on schools, sometimes I get, well, it was actually the schools that pushed people away. They'll say the school corporation, starting in the 1970s, actually starting in 1960, was integrated, and that's why people fled to Mishawaka and Granger and other parts of the suburbs. But we actually have a test case where Clay Township is entirely in South Bend School Corporation, right? But it's not in South Bend city limits at all. And this is Clay Township's population growth. It's from 1960 to 2000. If people were fleeing South Bend to the suburbs because of schools, why did they flee to a township that had South Bend School Corporation? It can't be that the schools caused people to go when the vast majority of time they were fleeing to Center Township, Clay Township, German Township, where there was massive growth, but again, all in the South Bend School Corporation. Obviously, today that has led to Harris Township growing and the Penn Harris Madison School District growing rapidly. But if you look at the initial rise, when everyone says in the 70s and 80s, South Bend started busing, South Bend started all these things, that's what caused South Bend's population decline. The largest growth in the county at that time was happening in South Bend School District, while this was happening to South Bend. So this was happening in the city limits, same school corp, but 2 different entities. So in my mind, the declining quality of schools and the problems we have today in our schools are not a cause or a cost. I'm sorry, they're not a cause of decline. Obviously, today it is a different scenario where we have the schools the way they are, and it may be they are a hindrance of people coming back to the city. But that decline in school quality or perceived decline in school quality was initially a cost of our decline. It was not a cause in my mind. But there's also other costs to this sprawling nature of South Bend's population decline. Suburban growth without any proper planning that we had led to unnecessary sprawl. This is a zip code map. So here's the zip code 46601. Here's the zip code 46614. And this is a simple map put together that is the average emissions based per household. So average CO2, carbon dioxide emissions per household. Green is really low, red is really high. This is Granger, this is Clay Township. But this is 46615, and this is 46617. So all the inner neighborhoods of South Bend, all people who live in small houses that are probably pretty close to their work, they commit very little carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But people who live in larger houses out on the suburban periphery contribute a lot of carbon dioxide. If this had been reversed, if say South Bend kept growing the way it had, this map would look a lot different. So that's a cost of our sprawl. But we've also now have an increased by the type of population decline we've had, we have concentrated poverty. This is 1980, this is 2010. So again, as you know, population kept dropping, but we actually see more impoverished residents inside the city limits than even in 1980, even as the whole population is dropping. South Bend's share of the county's impoverished residents has gone up while its population has gone down. You would think if the city was losing population everywhere, its share of impoverished residents would fall too, but we're seeing the reverse happen. And we know through tremendous amount of studies and research that children that grow up in concentrated poverty are dramatically negatively impacted. They have worse life outcomes if they live in concentrated poverty. It's not the fact that they grew up necessarily in poverty that's bad. It's when that poverty is concentrated in certain neighborhoods. And this is an insane statistic here where we're losing people, but we're gaining more and more the share of the impoverished residents of South Bend. Of St. Joseph County. And why is that? Well, it's because South Bend supports all the institutions that help people when they are impoverished. This city, which again has the highest paying jobs and has the majority of the jobs in the area, supports all these institutions. So I just threw together a few here. All of these institutions were either directly funded by city tax dollars or initially were and no longer are. So you have obviously Howard Park, which we all love today, which just opened, but then the Morris Performing Arts area, the Cove, Century Center, South International Airport. All of these institutions and other institutions like this, city residents subsidized, but the entire area enjoys them. It is a tremendous asset to the whole area that we have an airport. I'm sure most of the companies that are large in this area wouldn't be here today if we didn't have an airport. Well, city residents, South Bend city residents paid for those. We can also look at this list, which these are all nonprofits. So these are areas that do not pay taxes, but they are in the city limits of South Bend. And they're ringed by roads that the city, so city residents, have to pay for. You have huge ones like the Indiana University of South Bend, the Memorial Hospital, South Bend Clinic, St. Joseph County Public Libraries, the Farmers Market. And in no way I'm saying that these are a bad thing. These are great assets to the city. It's great that they're here. They should be here, but those do come with costs. They are, again, ringed by roads that have to be paved, have to be supported, and they don't contribute any taxes to the area, but they benefit the entire St. Joseph County region. And this is not a new problem. And we're going to end up with this quote here. This is from Mayor Lloyd M. Allen in January of 1972. And he was the last Republican mayor of the city of South Bend. This is right as his term was ending. And he said, "Those who need government services the most, the poor, the elderly, those lacking job skills will continue living in our city. Those who can afford to take care of themselves, provide the services and the tax base to support municipal services will continue moving out of the city. That must stop. It's the big problem we face in the next decade." And the only thing Mayor Allen got wrong about that, it was the problem that South Bend was facing over the next half century, not the next decade. And we're still facing it today. None of this is history. It's all right now. These are the new single family housing starts from 2020. South Bend, 45, county and the suburbs, 172. Even if we were getting a third, which is about our population, this number would be a lot larger. We'll see when the 2020 numbers come out, but this disparity is still happening. This is not that it's over and it's done. We're still building new houses on the edge every day. But we think inside the city, we might be turning a corner. This is the estimate for 2020. We might, like we thought in the 90s, we think our population per household has finally stopped shrinking. And we actually are seeing growth in the city again. Small growth, albeit, but we don't think we'll see a drop in the 2020 census from soon, but we at least think that we've stopped the bleeding and that we can go from there. But what next? What should we do with this information? Well, we should make decisions about where population goes because it has really big consequences. And city and county officials have to take this data into mind because a shrinking South Bend, a poorer South Bend, ends up being bad for the entire area. And that will lead to hard conversations about where money should go and support. But we also need to support organizations that end up building housing in South Bend. It's very hard to build housing in South Bend. Many of the neighborhoods in South Bend, you cannot build a house for what it's worth. So if you build a $180,000 house in a neighborhood that you can own, the housing market's only 60 grand, no one's going to build that house. It has to be up to nonprofits like the Northwest Neighborhood Association and others that have to foot that bill to make sure that our neighborhoods don't completely disappear. And we have to support those organizations. We can't just assume it'll happen on its own because the market won't do it. And we have to fill the gaping teeth. These are new houses that were built on the west side, and hopefully we'll see more of these. But if you want to learn more about this topic, you can read the entire series at westsb/morepeople. There's about 7 articles on it. Here are some great resources that you could look at. The Color Law by Richard Loffstein is a great resource. The annexation policy for the plan for the city of South Bend is on our city website. That came out in '92, but has some great data. And here are some others for you. And that concludes the formal part of the presentation. I'm not sure, Sarah, if you want to ask the questions.
Yes, I've got several.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Yes, thank you. That was very interesting. So much data that you had to go through. Awesome. So first question was, is the population per household data that you showed, was that local or was that national? And if it's local, does it track with the national data? So to put it another way, how much of our household decline can be attributed to children not staying in the area, brain drain?
So that number, the numbers I cited here, so the population per household, that is all local. That is our number. However, South Bend has exactly mirrored the country since the 1940s. So in 1940, the country was 3.6, and today it's still about 2.5. South Bend has kind of eerily, and I think a lot of other cities as well, we've tracked the national average very closely. So it wasn't necessarily that our children were leaving and not having their kids here. It was just, in the article, I have a sentence that it's not that our people left and went to Arizona and Florida. That did happen, of course, but it was more that they left and just left the city limits for other areas in the county. That was what was bigger than leaving for Florida. I'm not saying that didn't happen, but if you remember that first graph, the county as a whole is still growing. So it's not that St. Joseph County has lost out in the end to Florida and warmer climates overall. It's just that some of that has happened, but if you look at the rest of St. Joseph County, that hasn't slowed this down. So that number, though, does track the national average almost exactly correct.
Great. When you mentioned there was a state law that was passed for St. Joseph County only, someone asked what was that state law and when was that passed?
Sure. So that was in the early 90s. Mayor Kernan attempted one last push to annex. That was the map I showed with large areas of Clay Township and Center Township. He pushed for annexation. Him and Mayor Buter of Mishawaka both wanted to do large scale annexations. Mishawaka wanted to annex a lot of its northern portion where Granger is today. And that was a law that was passed that, again, it only impacted St. Joseph County. The way the law was worded, that it only impacted counties with a certain population, and ours was the only county with that population in the whole state. But it basically made it impossible for cities to annex unless 100% of property owners or residents in the area. It put a lot of other limitations on it as well that other cities in the state didn't have to deal with. And today, most of the state, that law, I think it went to court, and the court eventually said it was illegal, or they couldn't enforce it, but it was legal. It got mired in courts, but that was more to show how bad it got between the cities and the suburbs, that our state was passing laws just about South Bend.
Wow. There were a couple questions asked about race. So someone asked about the suburbanization and developing outside of city limits intentionally. Is that white flight? And someone asked, in what way is this discussion really about the dynamics of race and ethnicity?
Yeah, that's a large part of it. And unfortunately, it's only a 45-minute presentation, so I can only give very brief overviews of this. But race plays into this a lot. Obviously, as most of you know, the vast majority of the African-American population of St. Joseph County is in South Bend. It is impacted indirectly and directly by race. So I talked about the growing suburbs post-World War II. Well, you could only go to those suburbs if you were white. And I don't mean that as in like it was, I mean that very literally. So when this happened, when the government started pushing the live in the suburbs movement, one of the biggest pushes of that was the Federal Housing Authority would issue loans to returning veterans, but only if you were white. If you were a white veteran and you were returning, you could get a home loan through the VA for a new home that looked like Edison Park and that ended up looking like these down the line. But if you were African American, you could not get that loan. You were not allowed to get that loan. So that was the biggest push. For one, was that African Americans weren't even given the same help from their government to start these suburban housing pushes. And then, of course, there were covenants in these neighborhoods and other ways that the neighborhoods essentially tried to keep neighborhoods white, to say it bluntly. But there was also the impact of the fact that South Bend has always been the home of immigrants in St. Joseph County. So even today, you see most new immigrants who come here land in South Bend first. And that leads to, of course, what should I say, segregation of housing through that aspect alone is that it's usually this is where the cheap housing is. So this is where immigrants first come. So from a points, yes, this is a story of I mentioned it one slide, but it's kind of imbued into all of this. The veteran housing loans is just kind of one of them. And even when that changed, starting in the 1980s and 1990s, where there were protections where African Americans could get loans, it became the point where for 30, 40 years, all those veterans who were able to get the house originally built a lot of equity in their suburban homes, which that equity over time is billions and trillions of dollars in the housing market that if you stop it at the beginning, it really shorts people in the end.
Great. Then we had a couple of questions about taxes. So are taxes still the issue here? Someone said, what prevents South Bend from imitating New York City and having an income tax on those who work in the city? And then another related question was about the new high rises being built in South Bend for residential living. Is that bringing more tax dollars into the city?
Okay, lots of big questions.
Yeah, I can break them down again. They're all kind of.
Sure. For taxes as a whole, so very traditional taxes on property, that issue has largely been mitigated by the state. So about 10 to 12 years ago, the state, actually the residents of Indiana passed a constitutional amendment that caps taxes at 1% of your assessed value. There are some technicalities here and there, but essentially pre that issue, tax rates were higher in the city than in the county than in other areas. That has largely been gone. It's not completely out of the question, but largely today, everyone pays about 1% of their assessed value on their house. If you live in Granger, if you live in South Bend, tax rates, I would not say it's at all a driver of where you build a house today, simply because in the end, it won't matter that much to your tax rate. The tax rates between the cities and the counties have become very, very close, which wasn't always the case in the past. What was the second question?
What could South Bend, like New York City, establish an income tax on those who work in the city?
Well, Indiana, which obviously that is a state issue that the states create the frameworks for how cities can operate. And the state of Indiana doesn't like giving cities a lot of ability to do their own thing. So I don't even think the city could possibly do that. The county as a whole has a county option income tax. So everyone who works in St. Joseph County already pays an income tax. That goes to the state, which then goes to the county, which then gets to the city. So that does help a little bit. I'm not sure how scientifically it breaks down to where you work. I'm pretty sure it comes from where you work, but there is some of that where if you work in South Bend, let's say live in Granger, Mishawaka, or just unincorporated county, some of your income tax does end up trickling to South Bend, but some of it still goes to the county. So and I don't even think the city has the ability to implement its own income tax. I don't think the state of Indiana has granted cities that authority. It's only at a county level. And the third question was about the new high rises, so that is a big issue that a lot of people want to talk about whenever I talk about housing. I just want to also keep it into scale. So I think in downtown over the past, say, 10 years, I think we've built or are planning to build about 300 to 400 housing units. In the grand scheme of things, that's barely 1% of all housing units in South Bend. So you're talking pretty small numbers here still compared to the overall area. That is going to bring growth to the tax base, though, because again, all those income taxes for people who live here, they'll pay income taxes, and then the property that the buildings sit on will pay a lot of property taxes. The best money winners, it's actually not the way counties and cities make a lot of property taxes. It's not from anyone who owns a house like this, or even like this, on the grand scheme of things, because again, the county has capped them at 1%. Commercial and large apartments. So if you think of, say, the new Matthews building going up downtown, that is a pretty small geographical footprint. The whole site might be only as big as these two houses here, but it's going to have maybe, I think it's over 100 units, and it's going to be taxed at probably $10–15 million of value. So that alone will bring in a lot of revenue. But again, on the grand scale of things, you're talking about a number of units. While it's encouraging, we're seeing growth in housing downtown where we had not seen it for 50 years. We're still talking pretty small numbers that aren't going to impact the large scale trends too much.
There were a couple more questions in the chat. I see Paul has his hand up. So Paul, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, well, I worked at Bendix in the 70s, and of course, once they phased out, along with a lot of other, manufacturing jobs that were good paying jobs, it just, we didn't replace them with, good paying jobs as they went. They were replaced with jobs, but it seemed like to me it was mostly service orientated jobs, like stores and restaurants, things like that, which I think probably continue to force people to move out and get better paying jobs elsewhere. Is that what your thought is?
I think, and as the numbers show in jobs is, so that happened across the whole county, right? Mishawaka used to have ball band. There were Mishawaka's lost half its manufacturing jobs since its peak, and it never had that many to begin with. But they've still been able to grow their population. So obviously the decline in manufacturing has hurt the economic vitality of the city. Wage growth in South Bend has not kept up with the country for 50, 60 years. So from an economic standpoint, that's very vital. And the loss of those good paying jobs that were somewhat easy to get, at least compared to what you can easily get today, obviously had huge economic consequences. There was just less money in our area. But when it comes to population and how many people were in the area, St. Joe County keeps growing. So clearly there's something in the economy that there's still growth per people. It's just slower. But from an economic standpoint, yes, the factories closing and deindustrialization sucked a lot of wealth out of the area for sure.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of money in South Bend, but it comes from elsewhere. People come from outside the area to, spend in South Bend, but it doesn't stay here. The money is not made here at state. You know what I mean?
Yes, and there's also, so part of it too, and maybe this might not be as well known as maybe we should advertise, but I think it's 14% of all jobs in South Bend are still manufacturing compared to the national average of 6%. South Bend still has some large manufacturers. Obviously, it's not what it once was, but we still have a manufacturing legacy that other cities don't have at all. So there's that. Jonathan, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, I had a question. I was just wondering, when, I hate to come back to the Studebaker thing, but when Studebaker did close, South Bend left that factory vacant for many years. And, I think that would drive away people from wanting to live near a vacant factory and all the other, issues with that. What effect do you think that had on the suburb problem?
Well, there's no reason. So very good point. No one wants to live next to a crumbling factory, but the factory was about here. That was the main Studebaker complex. A lot of the growth we talked about today happened up here. There's no reason the imaginary lines of South Bend couldn't have included this. So yes, maybe the geographic location of the house, sure, maybe you can make the argument they didn't want to be close to, bad factories and poor neighborhoods, but there was no reason they couldn't still be part of the city limits of South Bend. That was a clear choice. So one example is Fort Wayne I give for a city that you could compare us to. In 1960, we were very close in population. I think we had 130, they had 160,000. Today, we have 100, they have 250. And they did that not because they have all their factories still, they've still lost all their manufacturing jobs, or at least a large majority of their manufacturing jobs like we did. GE had a massive complex downtown, just like we had Studebaker that's gone. The city's trying to redevelop it today. But what they did is they were able to annex almost all of Allen County because septic tanks in Allen County don't work very well. So residents who bought and built a house in unincorporated Allen County, they had to get on to city services. So you could have seen a situation where South Bend went the Fort Wayne route, and we tried to, where we annexed all this area, and then our population is 150, 160, 170,000. Now, what would that do to the ground level? Well, the city would have a lot more resources to invest in certain industries, but would the ground look that much different? I don't know. But there is the question of the imaginary lines. South Bend as an economic unit kept growing slower than it did in 1960 for sure. But we have more people today in St. Joseph County than ever before. It's just the imaginary lines of South Bend didn't keep up because of a variety of political reasons.
I understand. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and there was actually a question similar to that. Are there any other cities in the area, like in Michigan, Ohio, or Indiana or Illinois, that you would compare South Bend to?
There are a lot of cities. South Bend's a Rust Belt city. Some people don't like that term, but I actually think it just kind of aptly describes what we're talking about here. A couple that come to mind are like Toledo, very similar to South Bend's story. Akron has a very South Bend story. So in the last article of the series, I did talk about how South Bend held on to 100,000 people. So some cities that looked a lot like South Bend in 1960, Flint, Michigan, Canton, Ohio, where South Bend lost a quarter of our population, they lost over half or worse. So in that article, that last piece, I talk about what did South Bend do right to hold on to at least some population, where we didn't see a free fall collapse like we did. Obviously, Detroit is the poster child of Rust Belt's decline. Population, Detroit's dropped from like 1.8 million to 600,000. So you're talking whole, more orders of magnitude larger. But that last article, if someone's really interested in seeing us compared to other cities, that last article should help them out.
Yeah, and someone mentioned Palo Alto, comparing it they said it has about 3 times the number of people during the working day than at night, and it's one of the most desirable places in the area to live, and they thought it would be interesting to compare and contrast South Bend's situation to cities like Palo Alto. Just a different. Yeah, it's not at all uncommon that our city has a higher daytime population than nighttime. That's almost always the case for your central city. That illustration was just to show that people still have economic value here, that they still come here every day to work. It's honestly sometimes reversed, where you have a lot of cities. So one of the downsides of the fact that we have this very national media now, and we've really lost a lot of local media sources, is the fact that everything's national now, and everyone assumes every problem is the same everywhere. Where
So we will see people think that the housing problems on the East and West Coast, where you're seeing super rise in housing cost and housing prices, what you're seeing in those places is that the central city, so New York or San Francisco or whatever, what have you, is really desirable. And it's become so expensive to live there, it's pushing people out to the suburbs who still work in the city. So you're talking teachers, firefighters, they can't even get a house in their city because the housing prices have gone up so much. That's not what South Bend is saying. South Bend has the lowest median house cost of the area. Anyone who's really wealthy in this area could live in South Bend if they wanted to. It's not the fact, or anyone who has a stable job, could, at least we're the easiest to get a house than any other area. So it's almost the inverse of the problem. But it is interesting that that issue still persists. Eric, I think you have your hand up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks. That was a fascinating presentation. I grew up in South Bend and left pretty much at the time that Studebaker went under. And I've recently got interested again in my retirement and kind of examining what's happened to South Bend in the intervening 50 years. And the single issue that is most prominent in my mind, I mean, there's a lot of really cool stuff going on in South Bend right now, especially in regard to neighborhoods. But the one thing that I found in my own education the most lacking was a consciousness of race, which was invisible to me when I was growing up in zip code 46635 in part of Clay Township that was as white can be. I really didn't understand then what I've come to appreciate now, which is the dynamics of race and how influential that is in South Bend's history, and how easy it is to talk around race by talking about words that might be racially encoded, like poverty or schools or other things. And I don't know, what is it, 40% of South Bend now is Black or Hispanic or a racial minority? I mean, it's an astounding percentage, but it's always been to a certain degree white ethnic and African American. And I wonder if it needs to be talked about more.
No, it's a very hard thing to talk about, and I'm learning and trying to learn how to always get better about it. All these issues I talked about, you could point out where race was an underlying issue that caused this, or that was the reason for this, or what have you. And interestingly enough, I have a stat in the series, and I recommend anyone who, if this interested you at all, please read the series. It's took 6 months to write, and it's much more detailed than I could ever be in a 40-50 minute presentation. But one of the stats I have is that the white population of South Bend is the only population that's ever declined. The population of African Americans, people of Hispanic descent, Asian, those populations have only ever gone up. The decline in population has only been white residents. Now, that's even at a county level now we're seeing, where as a whole county, the county is growing, but the white population in St. Joseph County is dropping, as just we're becoming more diverse. So that is definitely a big issue. Obviously, it's no coincidence here, if you look at this graph, the areas hit hardest were the areas that had the largest concentration of African Americans. I talked about the housing bubble. There are books and books and books on how poor neighborhoods in general, just all poor neighborhoods and African American neighborhoods were specifically targeted by speculators, by landlords who had very discriminatory practices that pushed people out. But yeah, you're exactly right. There's so much you could say about it, and it's hard to capture it because it's there always, and it's very hard to explain that in a simple presentation format. But please read the series if you want to know more. I touch more on race in the series. There's also the book I mentioned, The Color of Law, I believe it is, that has a great source about that.
Yeah, that's a great book. And someone also recommended in the chat, Better Homes of South Bend by Gabrielle Robinson, which we just had a discussion of last week. And there's a recording on the SJCPL YouTube channel. And a recording of this program will also be on SJCPL YouTube channel. So definitely recommend checking that out. And someone also put in the chat that there's a Build Up South Bend group on Facebook. Up is in parentheses.
Yes.
There's more questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to keep talking, Joe.
Maybe one or two more, and then I think my wife will get at me if I spend too much time.
Okay.
Anyone, I can, if anyone wants to talk about these issues, I'm more than happy. I think somewhere on the West SB site that has the article, there's a contact me, button. So please reach out if you have questions, but I could probably take one or two more.
If anyone wants to unmute and ask your question, that would be fine.
Go ahead. I was just gonna wonder, you said that there hasn't been a census since 2010, but I mean, has there been any studies as the population?
Well, so we've had the 2020 census. We just haven't gotten the numbers back. So we're hoping to get those back. We were supposed to get them back right around now. Then that date has been pushed back to probably the summer. So when we know in the summer, I'll probably come out with another article that just talks about what happened from 2010 to 2020. But we just don't have the official numbers yet.
But I mean,
we have done the census.
But it doesn't look like the population's coming back a little bit.
The estimate is that we gained a little over 1,000 people, which would be only the second time since 1960 we've gained population. But we'll see when, estimates have been wrong before. So their estimates.
It seems like we've had a lot of building going on downtown and a lot of new housing, people
Yes.
back into the city. So that's a plus,
Yeah, so thanks again. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and staying in a little longer. Thank you, Joe, so much. You had a lot of great comments about how informative people found this presentation, that they loved it. It was really, really interesting. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks, everyone.